person refused to sit on the back of the bus. She changed the ride for all of us. Oh, that's the power of one. Her diary found a light in the dark. A young girl's hope touched millions of hearts. Oh, that's the power of one. One grain of sand can turn the tide. One single spark can light the night. One simple dream, one gentle word, one act of love from someone can start a chain reaction. It all begins in the heart, and the power of one. While the others threw stones, he didn't judge. He moved the world with the strength of his love. Oh, that's the power of one. One grain of sand can turn the tide. One single spark can light the night. One simple dream, one gentle word, one act of love from someone can start a chain reaction. It all begins in the heart, and the power of one. Oh, all the little things we do every day, the smallest step can bring on a change. Oh, that's the power of one. 'Cause one grain of sand can turn the tide. One single spark can light the night. One simple dream, one gentle word, one act of love from someone can start a chain reaction. It all begins in the heart, and the power of one. The power of one. The power of one. It's the power of one. Oh, it's the power of one.
Good morning and welcome to another edition of the Inclusion St. Louis Speaker Series. This happens to be our 8th edition out of our 9-week series, and so we would have a last one coming up next Monday in advance of our Festival of Nations season wrap up. I want to use this opportunity to thank all of you that are joining us today and that have joined us in the last eight past sessions, whether as part of the webinar or joining us on Facebook, or even watching this program even after our production here on Mondays, whether it's on television, on Facebook, or on YouTube. So we welcome you all. My name is Aroesty, President and CEO of the International Institute of St. Louis. And today, Monday, August 16th, we're going to, our theme is going to focus on communication, language, and more specifically, the words we use, how that affects progress towards a more inclusive St. Louis. But we cannot, especially looking at the images that we've seen on television today, we cannot move forward without just talking about our concerns, like everybody else that works in to support refugees and resettlement and immigrants, express our concern and for everything that is happening with the dramatic situation that is taking place in Kabul, Afghanistan. The International Institute and the community of St. Louis has been working towards mobilizing resources to be able to welcome Afghans who supported the war effort for 20 years. They worked alongside the military, and we have been collaborating both locally as well as nationally to prepare this community to welcome these Afghans who have to leave their country as a result of the fact that the war has come to an end. We're therefore very concerned with the developments, but we will continue to do the work that we have been doing to ensure that those who make it here are welcomed into our community and can join us here as friends and neighbors as we continue to try to build a more inclusive society here in St. Louis. I thought we should at least go on record that we, like so many people, express our concern and hope that the federal government would find a way to resolve the crisis and be able to help those whose lives are now in danger. For the many people who make it to this city, usually do so because they are fleeing circumstances that are beyond their control. And we work here to provide refuge for them, as well as an opportunity for them to achieve their greatest potentials. With that said, I'm going to turn to our conversation for today, which, as I mentioned at the start, it's about communication, how our language, our choice of words, the forums or mediums on which we communicate, how we communicate, how all of that affects progress towards a more inclusive society. We are lucky and very grateful to have with us three great women. We're really privileged that you've given your time to share your experiences with us. So let me start by welcoming the President and CEO of Focus St. Louis. Join me in welcoming Yemi Akande-Bartsch. Thank you, Yemi, for joining us. Next, she's somebody that I've just gotten to know, and I've learned a lot from our several conversations that we've had and working sessions that we've had. But she's a community convener. Please join me in welcoming Karen Aroesty. Thank you, Karen, for doing this. And also, she is a senior organizational development consultant with BJC Healthcare, happens to be our newest board member of the International Institute of St. Louis, and for many years, for several years, was the chair of our the youth, the Friends of the International Institute. Join me in welcoming Nergis Cavitt. Thank you, Nergis, for being here. Thank you all for being here. Let me say to the audience that as we proceed, and if you have any questions, we will be taking your questions that are in the Q&A section. We will be picking up your questions questions typically get lost when they're put in the chat room. So if you want us to address your question, it should be in the Q&A section. There's also no guarantee that we're going to answer all the questions because there's always limited time, but we're going to make our efforts to to answer as many questions as possible. For starters, I generally start this conversation with the question, is an inclusive St. Louis possible? If it is possible, how? If it is not, why? And let me begin with Yemi.
You know, I think I'd be remiss if I didn't actually start out by saying to everyone who speaks Yoruba, Kabo, which means welcome. And that's a very good question. And it's a very good question in light of just the environment that we're in. And I always operate from the perspective of what I would consider radical optimism, but one that is grounded. And so when you pose the question, is it possible? Yes, but it requires a lot of work. And I've seen a modicum of success in different pockets of our region, especially after the quadruple pandemics that we're still going through, where people are making an effort to do so. And something that I hope you'll ask me a little later on in terms of how do we do that? How do we get to that? And so I'll give a teaser right now and say the way in which we get to that of having an inclusive St. Louis is one that's welcoming, and we have colleagues that are already working in this arena, Betsy Cohen, but one that we don't always start out or continue with calling people out when they've done a wrong or when they've made a mistake. And we should think about a different way of doing that. And I'll share that later when we get to that question.
Thank you, Yemi. I should have said to your welcome, I should have said Modupe.
Oh, yes. Kutokwe. Oh, that's lovely. I love it. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I would turn now to Karen. Same question. Is an inclusive St. Louis possible?
I appreciate Yemi's optimism. I share that. I think the answer depends on who you ask. I think there are some who would feel very much so, and others who are in situations where they are constantly feeling less included and even targeted by those around them. So I think we have to be mindful of that. And part of that is stepping in other people's shoes and trying to understand why they feel that way. That's alluding also to what Yemi said relative to thinking down sort of to the future of intentional steps. But we certainly are having more conversations now than we used to. And there certainly is a higher level of awareness about different ways that different institutions, whether they are workplaces, schools, or community agencies, might take. But I think it's something we have to accept as an ongoing, I kind of call it the long game. But then I have to think, if I use the phrase the long game, is that an idiom that somebody who maybe is not as aware of American idioms or a baseball fan or a football fan or sports fan, whatever, understands? So I'll just say, I think it takes a level of intentionality and a very structured approach that considers ongoing efforts, and not just the one-off, not just the window dressing, but looking to all the different changes in current events that make us want to change the way we do this kind of work, intentionally creating a sense of belonging and inclusion for folks in the region. Is it possible? Sure. It's a lot of work. I agree with Yemi.
And yeah, to the point that you made, I noted several times that you highlighted the fact that it has to be intentional. This cannot happen by accident. Nergis?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and round out the optimism trio here, and then absolutely believe that it is possible. To both of the points that Yemi and Karen made, I think we do have to be intentional. I think for a very long time, folks have been working to make St. Louis more inclusive. The conversation might seem newer to broader audiences, but there's been a lot of groundwork that's been laid in the past. And again, there's a lot more to go. What I would like to see, and where I would think I'd feel a little bit more of that optimism shining through, is folks, kind of branching out into caring about lots of different sectors or lots of different causes. So for a very long time, it's felt very much like, this is something that I'm owning because either it's part of my lived identity or I have experience in this space. And so I feel comfortable trying to move the needle forward on this specific topic. But, to get a truly inclusive St. Louis city, county, the area, then I think we need to have, more mobilization of, I care about this cause and my cause supports your cause, and we can't really do it in these silos. And so that I have seen, in the last at least few years, make a lot more, headway in how do we lift all causes. And I think to Karen's point, there are folks who are, feeling the impact of maybe I'm not ready, or I don't necessarily understand, or what's in it for me. Right. So getting folks to come on board and recognize that it's not just, I'm trying to achieve this one type of inclusion for this one type of community, but how are we all working together to make that a little bit more possible?
Yeah, Nergis, I think you make a fair point here, which really explains why we have this inclusion St. Louis conversation going on, because the International Institute, yes, does work to support refugees and immigrants, but the outcome of the work that we do is larger than just immigrants and refugees, because it's for the broader society. And so thinking about it from an inclusion perspective seems, for us at least, opening up the conversation to the wider community. And we hope that this is what we achieve with this series of conversations that we've been having. Now, before I go into the specific work that each one of you have been doing, let's just talk a little bit about what does inclusive communication look like? What does this mean to each one of you? And obviously, based on your various backgrounds, you would probably have different perspectives to this conversation. But what does that mean? So, I was posting something on LinkedIn, and I thought about our conversation. And I said to myself, I have to be humble as I approach this conversation, because I may think I'm being inclusive in my communication, but that depends on the person that I'm speaking to or the person that's listening to. And I asked myself, so how can I be conscious about the way that I speak to the team that I work with at the International Institute that's very diverse? But what does inclusive communication mean to each one of you? Anybody can take it.
So Ari, I'll chime in. So I was thinking about, this and hoping you would ask that question, because as we are getting ready, when I say we, I mean my collective program directors for our programs this year, that is something, using Karen's phrase about being intentional, about how you invite people into conversations and making sure that your language is inclusive, making sure that it centers on a person and respects their individuality is very key. So when you ask, what does inclusive language mean? It, last year, my husband and I were in the marketplace looking for a new resident. And one of the things that we noticed that a couple of realtors tripped on is this way in which we describe the master bedroom. You can no longer use that term and think that it's inclusive in the way in which it is envisioned. And so we would watch and just tune into, okay, what are they going to say and how are they going to describe this bigger room? And it ranged in ebbs and flow in terms of people will say, this is this bigger room. And I said, let me help you out. this is the way in which this should be referenced. So those things are key. And, related tangentially to your initial question in terms of how can you be inclusive, center on the person, respect their individuality, and address them accordingly. And I was noticing how, my team members do this when they're talking. They reference their preferred pronouns. And Nergis, I noticed that you did that as well. And that is important. It's a way of inviting people in. And it's okay to say, you know what, I may fumble along the way, but help me understand, educate me on what your preferred pronouns are before we get into conversation and along assumptions, bias, and whatnot.
Thank you very much, Yemi, about that perspective. And I think you have highlighted two aspects there. The one is how we communicate, but the other is how we can invite people to communicate with us, right? In ways that enable us to be inclusive. So it's not just one way here, it's actually two ways. Yes, Karen, you.
I was going to add, and I appreciate Yemi's comments. There's two paths for me. One is, and going back to, I think it was Leslie's comment about sharing your pronouns up front as a way of sort of inviting somebody else to share theirs and then learning about each other that way. Wouldn't it be extraordinary if people communicated with each other by saying that initially? It would be a sea change for how we introduce ourselves, and yet how much we would learn from each other right off the bat if we did that to potentially reduce bias. The other piece of it is about how we respond to others around us, and that's the not allowing ourselves to be a bystander. So when we are in conversations where we hear something and we go, that probably was not going to fall well, that we actually step up and say something and fall into that ally category. That's also a sea change for folks, because having the confidence to step into that is something I think challenges a lot of folks. We don't necessarily learn this stuff in our traditional education systems, and so it's not something we're comfortable doing. And yet that could be as much a part of being inclusive and welcoming and helping somebody belong, to know that somebody is there to support them if they run into that kind of situation. And that's, again, down the line on questions, but for structures. How are we going to educate? What accountability are we going to have? How do we get people to stop sitting in that bystander space to becoming full participating allies and then friends and colleagues of? And that's an arc that requires all systems in this community to buy into quite significantly.
Yeah. So I think this follows in line with the aspect that you highlighted in terms of being intentional about this, because you're basically saying that there's also a responsibility here for us, for each one of us, to ensure that people don't stand in the sidelines of progress that's being made. We should educate ourselves as well as educate those around us, so that we're moving forward together. Nergis, would you like to share your thoughts on the subject?
Yeah, so I completely agree. And I think another way to look at inclusive communication is, again, from that people-centered standpoint, but to acknowledge that sometimes we paint a broad brush of what is considered the right way to communicate, or especially professionally, or for your voice to be heard. A lot of times we look at the professional, or look at the person who has the most experience, or the person that we think is the person to go to on a subject. And that is very exclusive to people who have, just lived experiences that aren't measured by achievements, or they aren't, on paper, or they're not degrees, or they're things like that. So being inclusive in our communication is also getting a lot of different perspectives. So what might have been, this is how we communicate with folks. It's a very structured way. It's, maybe in an email or things that are only accessible to certain types of people is kind of an older way of thinking, but what we've been used to, what has been seen as, the right way. So now I'm thinking about how do we change how we communicate? It's also how do we interact with folks? How do we get different perspectives to drive our communication in different arenas? They don't all need to be the same way. We don't have to rely on tactics that have worked in the past because they're, I think, quickly fading as folks begin to live a little bit more into their different identities that may have not in the past been represented in what we believe is true inclusive communication.
Yeah, that's actually a great perspective. I was just looking at a conversation that somebody put in the chat. It's not a question, so we don't necessarily have to answer it, but I think it ties with what you've been saying, Nergis, in reference to as we strive to become more inclusive and create opportunities for everybody to be part of the conversation. Is there a risk that we leave people out even in our efforts of trying to be inclusive? And what is such risk, and how can we mitigate the such risks?
If I may, just a quick personal story, I can say very easily that I've been doing this kind of work in this broad area for close to 30 years. And if I think that I'm not able to learn, I'm in big trouble, because I really loved your word, the notion of humility and being vulnerable. So in part, I was looking in preparation for today, thinking about some of those words that people still do take for granted. And one of them is, and I'll say it this way, the G word. Do you know what I say when I say the G word? I'll say it because it's part of the learning on this, but it's the word gypsy, right? So many people don't understand, particularly in the history of the Romani. And as the word came to be developed a long time ago, to lift up a stereotype of somebody who's not trustworthy for a whole variety of reasons. Well, my daughter, bless her, who's 26 and tells me everything I should know that I don't, said, you have to say the G word. You can't say it out loud. And I said, really? I said, I understand the nature of the sensitivity to it and that we have to retrain to help people understand, but do I have to say it that way? And she said, I think you do. I said, she said, if you don't, people are going to look at you in a negative way and say, well, you think you're saying all the right things, but you're really not. And you need to stop doing that. So lesson learned, and chalk one up for my daughter.
Yeah, anybody wants to follow up in terms of, the risk that we face whilst trying to be inclusive and leaving people out? I just thought that was very interesting because, we at the International Institute have had to figure out ways in which we try to be inclusive in the conversation, especially during the pandemic. And in language access, for example, is one of the things that, look, with the pandemic, we did not have a choice, right? But does it need to be a pandemic for us to be able to communicate directions on the railway, like how to get a train, or with technology and all the opportunities that we have, there are certain risks that we run. But what are ways in which that we can consciously mitigate those risks? I know language access is one, but what are some other things that we can be doing?
So two things, I'll just jump right in. First of all, I want to say that Karen Aroesty is an individual that I consider the civic language whisperer. She has presented to a diverse range of individuals. And, Karen, I'll call you out here, because even when you go into rooms where you think you know all the answers, you always lead your entry or your introduction is there are certain areas where you don't know what you don't know, but you are open to learning. And so I've always appreciated that about you. And Ari, to your question, I think it's okay just to dive in. And when you do have a misstep, don't bury it under. Just say, you know what? Here's what we learned. We are not speaking to an audience broad enough with this language or with this sentence that we've utilized, and we're correcting ourselves. And you make that change then. And those that are going to forgive will forgive. And those that are going to hold on to it, I like to say they keep you accountable. And so it shouldn't be taken as, oh my goodness, this is blowing up. Thank you for being our accountability partner, for pointing us in this direction, that how we came across does not resonate with all. And here are the changes that we are making and moving forward. And you just keep on moving forward, haven't acknowledged it.
I think that's a really, really good way to approach it. Let me come back. I know you did mention Karen, so I'm going to come back to Karen and ask a little bit. In your work as a convener and an advocate for social justice in the region for a long time, would you say, in your experience, that we are becoming more inclusive as a community? And you can connect this to the subject matter of communication. Are you seeing any changes in the way that we communicate with one another over time that is giving you hope that we're moving in the right direction as a community?
When I came here to go to graduate school in 1986, ATMs and all sorts of interactive devices, let's say at the grocery stores and stuff like that, they were only in English, right? And now you have the opportunity to do multiple language choices. Certainly in certain, call centers, you can do that. I think there is an effort being made for things not simply to be bilingual, but potentially trilingual, and to say we're going to have folks available. If you need a particular language assist, we're going to help you do that. And so I think that is a structural change. And I think the folks that have made the commitment to do that understand that that's not just a business decision, right? That's about community goodwill. That's about enhancing status in community and doing things for folks that that helps create. By the way, if there's a business decision for it, I'm okay with that. Right now, whatever motivates is valuable. And I think that's one of the big changes. I think when we saw the pandemic issues come up, I work with the St. Louis County Human Relations Commission. One of the issues that came up there was I think it's the 211 system. The emergency system wasn't language helpful. All these folks were trying, and so they had to get on the ball really fast to find those resources. And so I think where there are the missteps or the open gaps, they do get filled because there is a recognition that that's a person on the other side who needs help. So I have seen that. And I'd like to think there's more of that we can do in terms of broader availability. And maybe some of that is internet-based. Maybe the cyber world has also helped with translatable options. But if you have a company, if you have a school, if you have a community group that does it as their own intentional action in terms of how they go out in a community, how much more positive is that for people? How much more does that help people really feel like they are belonging? So that's the biggest change I think I've seen.
Great. Thank you. Nergis, I'm going to turn to you, and because of your work at BJC, where you're working to improve equity in care, and you've been conducting research on the effects of the feeling of inclusion. Would you like to share some trends that you're seeing, developments that you're seeing that, adding to what Karen has just shared?
Absolutely. So in my research in my prior work, which was, maybe started quite a long time ago now, It was looking at corporations primarily and seeing what people needed to feel like they belonged at work, what made them feel included, what made them feel heard and listened to. And even then, that was rich data in terms of, I just want someone to ask me what I do after work, ask me about my family, talk to me in a way that isn't, super professional robot 24/7 every time we're on the call. I just want us to feel a little bit closer. And I think what the research has shown, even from that long time ago up until now, is that that line continues to blur almost to the point that it doesn't really exist. And especially since the pandemic, I think folks feel now that there is so little line between, my professional life or being at work and being at home, especially if you are privileged to work at home and you are, in that safer environment, that it's all kind of one and the same. And so inclusion is so much more important because you're literally, for many people, living in your space, in your own bubble at work, and people see so much more of you. And so the walls start to come down. And that is not just, I think that with my team, I can be this way, or it's okay when I'm on this meeting, but it is an expectation of organizations now to say, inclusion looks like it's okay to have, your cat walk across. This is me. My cat walk across the desk in the background. Your kids are over here. I know everyone in your family because I've seen them now for a year. Things like that. But, in the work that we have all been doing with my team and a larger department of the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion that was created at BJC in November of last year, has really been capitalizing on the push from, not just the community, but what's happening across the world, to really say, what do we need to hear from people? Who are we not hearing from? How do we integrate that into our care? Not just, healthcare, but how are we making folks feel like they're a part of the organization, like they belong each and every day. So for me, in my work, a lot of it has shifted from, here's what, we need to teach people. Here's what we need to push to leaders for them to understand how to be a great leader in this organization. And now more into, how do we create leaders who are people, pillars in the community, because we support the community. That is why we exist, is to care for the communities in St. Louis. So not just, patients that come in, but also all of the folks that work here. And how are we giving people that knowledge outside of, this is clinical knowledge that you need. This is something that you need to be an awesome leader within our organization. But how do we also give you this extra layer of, here's what's really important to our area, so that we can be a little bit more of a inclusive society and move the needle with the very large number of employees that we have that could, help towards that task.
So much broader than even what we say, choice of words, but even intentional in how we structure our program so that it changes the calculus of how organizations are positioned within the community, thereby changing as well the community itself. Yemi, from your, what are some of the things that you are doing at Focus St. Louis, or that we can be doing as a community to ensure that we're being inclusive in the way that we communicate, being intentional towards building an inclusive society?
So thank you for that question. I think I know that the pandemic has given me an opportunity as a leader at Focus to be more vulnerable. And through that vulnerability, people have really gotten to know me deeper than they would have going through any number of our program days. And, a little bit to what Nergis had shared before, it's about showing that you're a human being, that you are truly concerned with people. I feel like now, because of the pandemic, I pretty much know all the names of the cats of my employees. I know them when they walk across the screen. And a couple of months ago, my husband and I got the surprise of a lifetime. And the surprise of a lifetime was something that we had been working on for quite some time. And that was adoption. And we got matched for adoption in the middle of the pandemic. And I was trying to debate, how do I share it with my team? And I was just full on vulnerable. Flipped on Zoom that day, and it was the last order of business that I shared with them. And I couldn't even get through it because I was just overcome with emotion. And I said, well, as of 2:00 tomorrow, I will become a parent. And that's how we dove into it. And just being that open, sharing with people, keeping people front and center about what their needs are. I feel like I know Karen really well. I know her daughter. I know what's happening with her. And that is something that when you let it just flow, it's a beautiful thing. And it can help address many of the questions that you've been asking us about inclusive language, because you get to know how to truly respect people with how they're showing up in a way that could make us all much closer, and in a way that could move the needle on so many issues in our region.
Thank you very much.
If I may, there are two things to that. That
Yeah.
vulnerability could not be overestimated enough, and sending love and hugs to Yemi so much
Thank you.
cool fun. But we're not vulnerable, right? We generally are in our silos, as Nergis has said, and we don't come out of them, and it is uncomfortable to do so. And again, that's not something that I think workplaces are generally and intentionally looking at helping people do. For so long, for the last few years, it's been this "I am right, therefore you are wrong" paradigm. And in terms of language and behavior generally, that's one of the quickest things we've got to get away from. I mean, you used humble in your LinkedIn post, RA, I think people reacted to that really strongly. And there's something incredibly optimistic about it too. But you have to work at it. It's not going to come naturally. You really have to work at it.
Yes, thank you, Karen, for that, because we all have to work at it. I run into these missteps every day, especially in the at the International Institute. We have a very, very wide, diverse group of people that we work with, and you're bound to run into or to have these missteps. And what I quickly learned is that, yes, I must admit that I don't have all the answers and move forward. Let me just pick up the one question that we have from, actually we have two questions. There's one from Ella Gross, which is really asking about whether the International Institute offers programs in multiple languages. Yes, please do reach out to us, Ella. We would put our contact in the chat room so that you can connect with us in that regard and we can answer that question. But we have a question from Lara Zwaron, and Lara wants to know, how do we use inclusive communication when addressing groups broadly, such as in advertisement, in a public service announcement, or in other places where it's not possible to solicit the individual input or what is preferred? Which I think is a great question, because we have been talking a lot more about intimate conversations, but what about when speaking broadly to the community? How can we be intentional about that so that it's inclusive?
Could I just say real quick, we just do it. I know that sounds simplistic. I don't mean it to. I think one of the things that marketing often does is segregate people into the appropriate demographic to get the appropriate message. And I think when we do that, okay, we may be talking to people where they are at exactly, but we're missing a lot more. So maybe it's about being more effective at creating broader messages that will call people into being part of something, and not segregating markets. Although I understand, if I say it right, market segmentation is a thing for the people who are pro in that area. I apologize, but I think you can do it as a both and, not as an either or.
So Ari, I'd like to add to what Karen said there. So a couple of nights ago, I was, TV was on as kind of just background noise. And I heard a commercial come on for, I think it was a local bank, Carrollton Bank. If this is not you, apologies, maybe you should consider it, but I think it might have been Carrollton Bank. And it actually started with an interview of clients. They were at this round table, and all of a sudden it just switched to Spanish. And I walked back into the room because I was like, okay, for starters, we don't have cable. So what happened here? And I was just like enthralled and just riveted, standing in front of the screen going, wow, I love this. I have got to look up Carrollton Bank, because hearing the Spanish to me suggests, implies that they are global in their orientation, and they're inviting people who speak other languages in. So to Karen's point, you don't always have to, segment and want to capture all. You can use one to represent all.
And I just want to add to Yemi's point. A lot of the language that we've used and we've had conversations about in the International Institute, and then especially within our young friends group, is how we market, to the point that RA made earlier, is that we're not just trying to fulfill the mission of the Institute for specifically the people that it serves, but it also serves the greater community. So a lot of times when we'll have conversations or we'll create events, we'll use the language like our community of St. Louisans, because it is more broad. It's not to say I'm calling out, this person or that person, but it's putting it out there that even if it's not already defined in a specific way, even if it is for a specific organization, by saying, creating this community that may not be inherent to what the event is, by just calling it St. Louisans, we're all, in this work together, is really helpful to get, a broader base of people coming in that's not specific to one organization or specific to one outcome.
Thank you very much, Nergis, for that. So let me mix this up a little bit, because we all, through no fault of us, come to every conversation. I always say that we are a sum total of our experiences, and how we communicate typically is based on the experiences that we have. And those experiences could sometimes become our biases towards others. How can we recognize that our own bias? How can we recognize our implicit biases? Is there a technique that we can use, or tips that we can use to correct those when communicating with others, whether it's on social media or whether it's in person? And a lot of that has happened throughout this pandemic, where we have typically, I for one, may have been seeing things from the perspective of the experiences that I've had, which could be very, very different from experiences that other people have had, whether it's a conversation over masks or vaccines or whatever it is. I could be approaching a conversation based on my own experiences. And how can we learn to look beyond everything that we have learned in life to open up to other people's perspective in a conversation?
I'll jump in real quick and just say, first, we just have to accept that we have those biases, and not beat ourselves up for it, not be defensive about it. And that's a challenge nowadays, but just accept that they exist. And that awareness piece, and again, adding to the humility that you mentioned earlier, RA, goes a long way to allowing us to be open to stepping into places where we might say something wrong, but then allow the person to give us some grace to be on a learning curve. And also to understand it's not something that ever ends. If you say to people, everybody in this room, raise your hand who thinks they're prejudiced, you're not going to get anybody to raise their hand. But if you ask people, do you prejudge people? Do you prejudge situations? You're more likely going to get a few folks who will go, okay. And at least that's a start. And then it's ongoing education. It's the arc of possibilities, the people you meet, the places you go, the things you're willing to learn. And it's multi-layered and many-lensed and all the other multi things I can add in. But the start is just being willing to say, I might have some bias I got to work on, and that's okay.
Thank you, Karen. Yemi, would you want to add something to the conversation before we go on to the next?
Sure. So, the calling in notion that I mentioned earlier has to do with, giving the other person or even yourself an opportunity to explore deeper whatever that bias is on, and attempt to make meaning together and find a mutual sense of understanding across the difference. You might not be on the same page, but at least starting that conversation. So you can even start it with such things as, I'm curious, what was your intention when you said whatever it was that they may have said? And it can be followed up with, how might the impact of your words or action differ from your intent? So those are deep questions that peel back the layers of the onion, so to speak. That's an invitation to conversation instead of necessarily just shutting people down right out. Now, granted, there are some days and some instances where you just have to kind of do that total shutdown. But at least, it's okay, going to Karen's point about humility, of asking them deeper questions. What criteria are you using that brought you to that final decision of what you're talking about, or even asking them, what do you assume to be true about such and such? Those are ways in which you can call people into a conversation that you can get to a deeper level understanding.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. I remember once I was in South Africa and celebrating Mandela's 100th anniversary, and I was emceeing an occasion, and I did start the conversation with ladies and gentlemen, and I later found out that that was a huge misstep, but it was an opportunity for me to learn, because had I not made that mistake, I wouldn't have understood that in trying to be inclusive, we can start by, segmenting people into ladies and gentlemen. We cannot talk about inclusive communication without talking about the media. And, how can the media, or how can we keep the media even more accountable in ensuring that the words that they use are intentional and advance inclusion? And maybe it's not necessarily for us to keep the media accountable, but maybe, what our thoughts are about how the media can help us become more inclusive by the words that they use. Any thoughts about that? Karen, I see you nodding.
I'll go if no one else speaks up first. I think media literacy is something that also needs to be taught in schools. I think it is often that we just assume that the media that we consume is all correct and doesn't have bias. So if we look at the words they're using very carefully, if we look at the headlines that are being used, let's say in print, the headlines that are used to draw us in, are they really connected to the article that is contained under the headline? Sometimes not so much. Then it is our responsibility to write those letters to the editor, to call the people we know. Maybe in many cases, journalistic accountability has somebody's email address or their Twitter feed or something like that, to send them a note and say, hey, not cool. Can you help me understand why you did this? And we are in effect helping create a more effective form of journalism when we do that. But at the same time, they have accountability. And I think they have to understand that the market of people they are talking to is much more broad than they realize. And that they have to be accepting, in the old days when you wrote a letter to the editor, nobody ever apologized. I mean, there was this consensus that no newspaper was ever going to actually offer a retraction. And I think I see more of that, because I think I see people willing to say, okay, we could do this better the next time. But it has to be taught, and we have to understand what it is. And then we have to be willing to step into that uncomfortable space to actually act on it.
Yeah. And getting to a larger extent, that notion of what used to be the traditional media seems to be evolving to include all forms of other communication nowadays. So whether it's a social media communication, and I typically, when I have to write something on social media, nowadays I actually become nervous about what I'm writing to make sure that what I'm writing, because I know that my words matter and they have impact on people who read it. But what are some tips that we can share with our audience about, one, there is the responsibility of what we term traditional media, but also the responsibility that we play as part of the media nowadays in the messages that we tweet or share or forward. What are some tips that we can give people to ensure that you're all being inclusive, even as you play your part in this communication space that we are in today?
So Ari, I'll go ahead and dive in on that. I'm actually glad you asked this question because I'm trying to think which one of our new editors of one of our local TV stations here invited people to reach out to him just to give feedback on how they're doing. And I thought, wow, that is different. But that is also a good way for us to start to hold the media accountable. They've invited us in. Now the onus is on us, similar to what Karen said, to pick up that phone, to write that email, send it off. And to your question about, what tips do we have? When in doubt, that should tell you something. Pay attention to what your intuition is telling you, and don't be nervous. So reach out to someone who is in that space, who's knowledgeable about, whether it's the broadness or a particular sector that you're trying to, reach into, to find out, how do I frame what I'm trying to say? Or perhaps have them review whatever it is that you're trying to put forth to make sure that it is received well. Another thing that you can say, depending on how quickly that you need to get that out, is perhaps saying on the onset, we're attempting to be as inclusive as we possibly can. And I like this question because, I'm drawing back from, years of being a college professor in my dissertation, which was a semiotic analysis of the science of signs and how signs is broadly used across mediums. So that being language, that being now social media, advertising, and all of that. And so it's important for us to kind of put on that lens of others. How is this going to be received? Am I being respectful? Am I calling out my own bias? And how can I write to the middle where it's broadly accepted? And going back to inclusivity and going back to, I think Betsy Cohen might be in the room here, of how can we be more welcoming of immigrants, refugees, you name it, the broad band of the diversity that is represented in St. Louis. And there are people that know it well. There are people that we can ask who are members that can help with that. I'm sure they'll be willing and they'll give you grace.
Nergis, did you want to add to that question on the media?
Yeah, I just have a quick thing to add. I think, in the past, we thought of the media as being folks formerly in that field. We, for the most part, as public, were consumers of media, and that's it. And now we are also the media. So I want to make sure that it's, we are, when we say people who are in the media, I think there are levels to this, right? There are people who are in it, that's their day job. They are, journalists who you can write letters to and communicate with, but each of us individually have, the responsibility to uphold these inclusive conversations or invite people in or be vulnerable in those spaces and say, hey, call me out and let's have this conversation. Because once we tweet something, once we put it on Facebook, once we share a post, it's there and that is for public consumption. And so, thinking about what we need to do for the media is not just how do we have conversations with folks who are paid, to report out on information and have to be knowledgeable about everything in the background. And maybe they write it towards one group of people who consume one type of messaging or another, but how are we as individuals holding ourselves accountable too, and those around us in our own circles? Because it's one thing to say, I want to make sure that the news, insert channel or radio station or whatever it might be, reports out on knowledgeable, fact-based things. And then there's maybe opinion pieces and things like that. And there's a way to do that. And I think we also need to make sure that that doesn't only apply to folks that are formally in those spaces, but that we're aware. So Ari, when you said, sometimes you're nervous, me too. Every time I start to write a post, I'm like, let me make sure, let me ask a friend, got an accountability partner, check through all the things, right? And if there is something in there, I would hope that someone feels comfortable, and I do invite them in to say, that maybe didn't land well, or maybe you left, this community of folks out, or you should have said, X, Y, Z. So just knowing that it's not a matter of only how do we, call people in who might be professionally in that space, but how do we, make sure that our circles are upholding that too?
Yeah. Well, thank you all for the time. Before we wrap up here, there's never enough time to have these conversations, but I earnestly hope that this conversation doesn't end here, that we continue to have it. Just to plug in here, the Inclusion St. Louis Speaker Series is part of our Festival of Nations season. We're going to be having our last one next Monday, which is the vision of an inclusive St. Louis and the perspective of future leaders. So we're bringing together a diverse group of 6 young St. Louisans, and we want to hear from them what they see as the future of an inclusive St. Louis, because that should inform the work that we do in trying to build a more inclusive St. Louis. And on the 28th of August, we're going to be wrapping up our Festival of Nations season with our grand finale at the 9 Mile Garden. Registrations for tickets, free, are open, but we want to be conscious about who is coming so that we can be responsible with everything that is happening with this pandemic. With that, let me turn to Yemi, Karen, and Nergis. Thank you very much for being with us today, for sharing your wealth of experience. And I have a conviction that we're going to continue this conversation in several other forums as we strive to build a more inclusive St. Louis. Thank you very much.